Hello and welcome to The Table. This is a lead-in episode for Edible Empire. Hosted by Planet Pulse Pacific, this is a podcast series about the hidden cost of our food. Connecting from across the globe, we would like to take a moment and acknowledge the traditional custodians and their millennia of stewardship. We honour their deep, ongoing connection to lands and the environments that we discuss throughout this series.
We're your Planet Pulse Pacific hosts, Ben and Emma. For this special series, we're collaborating with photojournalist and researcher Dr. Neal Haddaway, based in the UK, and supported by phenomenal special series editor Kelly Allum. 2 years ago, we interviewed Neal thanks to Dr. Jen Lavers. He had been working with Jen in Lord Howe Island off Port Macquarie, working with seabird researchers and the emotional toll of the plastics crisis facing the delicate ecosystem there. We discussed their project and his ongoing work with the impacts of food supply chains. If you want to hear that episode, check it out in Season 5, Episode 2. But since then, a seed of an idea has grown around focusing a special series on the global impacts of our food. 2 years later, here we are.
When we talk about food, we tend to focus on recipes, flavours, and dinner times. But what we rarely discuss is where our food comes from. And we don't mean which supermarket. We mean the ingredients that make up our food. Where did they come from? Who grew the vegetables, picked the fruit, and processed the oils? What's life like for them? And what does their environment look like as a result of what they're exporting for us to eat? From the plantations of the British Empire to the smart agriculture within ultra-modern greenhouses, food has always been a tool of power and of profit. This is a story of how some cultures were dismantled to feed others, and how those empires live on through corporate control. This is a podcast about food imperialism. This series explores the complex, often uncomfortable intersection of appetite and authority. We're looking at food imperialism, how the quest for calories and commodities reshaped the map, redefined our identities, and continues to influence who gets to eat and what in the 21st century. Let's dig into the politics behind the plate.
So, for our listeners, we wanted to give some context and explain firstly what food imperialism is, and secondly, why this podcast series came about. So, Neal, I've got to be honest, before I met you, I'd never heard the term food imperialism before. So do you just want to expand on that for our listeners in case they haven't heard it either, what we actually mean by food imperialism?
It's a really good question, Emma. It's a phrase that I read first in a report that was talking about the extraction of fish for fish meal in salmon farming. And it stuck in my head, really. I think because it was the first time I'd ever thought about empires existing today built around food and trade rather than political boundaries. And food imperialism essentially is a lens that we can use to understand why our food systems look the way they do. It essentially says that nation states and corporations in the global north, in the richest parts of the world, control what food is produced and how, and what food is also imported into countries in the global south, the global majority. And it's a way of controlling production to meet the needs of these wealthier nations whilst using and exploiting resources at will from countries who are in need of support in their economies. And so it talks about control. It talks about expanding the sort of the area of control for these nations and these corporations as well through treating food as a commodity rather than treating food as a human right. And so it's a concept that I found really interesting. And at the time I was doing research and photography work looking at the impacts of food supply chains and the idea that empires have shifted from what might have been an empire 100 years ago, like the British Empire, to being a corporation that's controlling what's going on in other countries, not only through the sale and trade of goods, but also through corporate lobbying. And as I started to read more about food imperialism, it was this sort of concept that existed in the literature in the 1980s, but really only was being used to describe what happened when fast food was being imported into developing nations and how the export of an American style of food consumption was affecting developing nations through, for example, switching of healthy whole food items that people were eating to highly processed, low nutritional value foods like fast food, and how that was then having knock-on effects on culture, on obesity, on things like diabetes, and then resulting in the need for importing of diabetes drugs. And so that way of thinking about the way that food systems change being driven by the need to make more money was such an eye-opening and really obvious, when you think about it, lens, a way of looking at things. So it really appealed to me. And as time's gone on and I've read more about it, there are aspects of that lens that just make more sense. And so one of the things that we've been working on in our project is something called the Food Imperialist Playbook. And it's thinking about the ways to spot food imperialism, the kind of interventions like corporate lobbying, greenwashing, litigation by corporations against activists that help to reinforce the status quo, which is that food is treated as a commodity for profit. So I think that's something I really wanted us to tackle. And in this podcast series, I think it's been really interesting to try and tell that story through specific examples, right? So the idea for the podcast came about because of a project I was working on called The Salmon and the Tomato. And it is just one example of perversely linked food supply chains. Salmon farming in the global north requires wild fish to feed the salmon. Those wild fish are taken from the global south, from West Africa, and that causes a local problem that then has knock-on effects where people migrate to Europe to try and get a livelihood, and many of them get trapped in exploitative labor, like the greenhouses that produce our winter tomatoes. So those kind of stories are stories about salmon and tomato, but they're stories about so much more. They're stories about, how weird and crazy our food supply chains are, our food system is, and how much is hidden behind the scenes. And so what we wanted to bring into this podcast series really was a few of those examples that illustrate the problem and how important this framework is for understanding the world today, really.
So the salmon and the tomato is really a culmination of your early days of starting to join the dots, right? With all the research and all the photography, you started seeing a pattern and the unusual link between salmon and tomato, because it's sort of how do you put those two together? Give us a little bit more insight into how you got to that point, which today has now led you to a children's book, an exhibition, so many flow-on effects from that. But give us the insight into the early days that got you to joining those dots and why those two particular.
I started this project really with a sort of unrelated research trip to Almeria, where I was doing a little bit of training for consultancy work, unrelated to photojournalism. And while I was in Almeria, I got commissioned to do a photo essay on the sea of plastic for a magazine called Artifact that came out in 2023. And while I was there, I saw, the scale of the greenhouses. I met some people who worked in the greenhouses who were living in one of the slums there. And I was really shocked by both the social and environmental problems that collectively hadn't really been discussed much in the media because it was a very complex set of problems. And when I returned to the UK, I went up to Scotland, completely unrelated. I spend a lot of time on Google Earth looking for interesting things to photograph from above with my drone. And normally it's a relatively sort of aesthetic, somewhat superficial interest in shapes and patterns. But this took me to the salmon farms, these concentric rings in lines off the coast, looked very curious. And so I went there and photographed them, saw the kind of destruction and the environmental costs that were happening there with pollution and dead fish, and got chatting to some activists while I was there. And one of them said, you should follow the feed, see where the feed is coming from to feed these salmon. And I found this report by the organization Feedback called Blue Empire that was charting the scale of the destruction to artisanal fisheries in West Africa, driven by Norwegian salmon farming. And that really opened my eyes to the social impacts, the indirect social impacts of salmon farming. And following that line, I found a research article by Noam Chen-Zion, who's a researcher who was working in Barcelona, who had interviewed some Senegalese fishermen who, after migrating by small boat, a journey that is perilously dangerous, 1 in 5 people who take that journey up to 10 days by small boat die on their way to the Canary Islands. But some of the ones who had survived ended up working in restaurants serving stolen fish to tourists, essentially. And it's a wonderful article that's really beautifully written. And there was one seed of information that was my eureka moment. I was reading this, and one of the interviewed fishermen said they had arrived in Badalona in Barcelona, having worked in greenhouses in Almeria. And I was like, whoa, these are worlds colliding. I was in Scotland reading this at the time. And I was like, right, there's a salmon farm right there. They get their fish from West Africa. That overfishing causes people to travel to Europe, to Spain. They end up getting stuck in exploitative greenhouse agriculture to produce tomatoes that end up on my plate. So I've got a salmon there and a tomato here, and that loop covers a huge proportion of the world. It causes a huge amount of destruction, and nobody knows about it. And so I've spent the last 3 years really diving into this to see how common is it? How many people are there from West Africa who find themselves in the greenhouses? What is their experience? And it's just a story that, it's really emotive, because that simplification of down to salmon and tomato that ends up on our plate has this rich history, this rich story, and a scale of environmental and social destruction that is really compelling because of its opaqueness, because of how hidden it is. And so that's the project that I've been working on. And yeah, as you say, we've got a recipe book, a children's book, we've got a documentary film. There's an exhibition at the moment in Munich that runs until the 18th of October. That immersive exhibition is produced in collaboration with an artist working in the greenhouses in southern Spain, and with a community there as well. And so it's become this huge body of work that this podcast is now part of as well. And it's the way of telling this story in different ways and different aspects of such a sort of complex story, really. And I think it is one that people will really want to hear and get sort of righteously angry about.
Given what you've just run us through, it's obviously an enormously wicked problem. So no single person is going to be able to explain this global food system to us. I think what I'm really excited about in the series is we have such a fantastic mix of guests that are going to be providing different perspectives. Did you want to run us through, the episodes and who our guests are going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so psyched about this. I remember us discussing, we had this wish list of people who could talk about different aspects. And I think we had a couple of people who were like, no, I'm not available, unfortunately. But, almost everyone said yes. And almost everyone replied really quickly to say yes with no follow-ups needed, which I think really goes to show how important this story is and how the idea of food imperialism as a lens really touched people. And so we wanted to have a bit of an intro to what food imperialism is, what is a food system? And so we have gone to, I would say, the 2 leading experts in this in the world. We are so lucky to be able to speak to Harriet Friedman, who, together with Philip McMichael, came up with the idea of food regimes, these transitions from one state of a food system to another. It's such a fundamental, important way of seeing food history and understanding, why does food today look the way it does? And it's because we've got hundreds and hundreds of years of political history and, these transitions that have sometimes been deliberate and sometimes been sort of accidental and a bit of a cul-de-sac. And so we have this really rich discussion with Harriet about the importance of history. And then we've gone to someone who I think is referred to as the rock star of food systems, Raj Patel, who was just a joy to speak to, and so
he rightly earns that title, I think.
He really does, doesn't he? And, speaks in such compelling way, right? And has a really personal connection to food systems because he saw poverty, and that lack of access to food has really driven what he does. And what was really amazing to me speaking to Raj, I think, is that he's an outspoken activist and an academic, demonstrating that, this this idea that you need to be an objective scientist is just not true. And he has given us such an amazing rundown of, why our food system looks the way it does. And actually, it's not broken. It's designed exactly as it should for profit, and that it is not picking up the tab, to quote him. So that intro episode is really rich, gives a historical lens, and then this really digestible way to understand what a food system is. And then we dive into corporate concentration, because one of the ideas behind food regimes, as we'll hear, is that we might be entering a corporate regime where corporations are now deciding what the food system looks like. And so we've spoken to two of the world's experts again on corporate concentration in the food system. And so we've spoken to Phil Howard and Jennifer Clapp about that concentration, what it looks like, why it's important, why the lack of diversity, at the middle of the food supply chain is a problem. And so Phil sort of really works around this idea that the food system is an hourglass shape, that we've got a concentration of a tiny number of massive corporations like Unilever that control what we eat. And so that episode is really vital as a sort of scene setting to understand why, the food system hasn't just evolved the way it is and as a result of national governmental policies of who gets to eat what and produces what. It's really under the control of, what can make the most profit. And these problems that we see, social and environmental problems, these externalities, are just costs that we can offshore somewhere. And, they are not things we actually pay for. They're things that other people pay for. And then we've got, 3 case studies. We've got, starting out with oil palm, which is probably one of the earliest, along with sugar, examples of a food commodity that was really used to shape politics and produce empires and fuel empires, really. And so we've spoken to the historian Jonathan Robbins about what oil palm looked like before empires came along, and how the British Empire sort of transitioned this agroecological crop from West Africa into what is now like a global dominating commodity, oil palm, that's primarily produced in really damaging plantations in Southeast Asia. And so we've also spoken to the conservationist Farwiza Farhan, who's working on the front lines of oil palm plantation expansion in Indonesia, and the researcher Hannah Navaki, who works with oil palm in Malaysia, starting off looking at how haze from burning peatlands was just seen as a collateral for economic expansion. And I think those two sides of the coin, which is the sort of focusing on the negative impacts on ecosystems and on people, and then the reasons behind the push for oil palm to support these economies, and just seeing that those negative impacts as collateral, are really two interesting sides of that coin. Then we have the case study that's really close to my heart, the salmon and the tomato, and we speak to a range of amazing people. Simon Setra, who's the journalist who's written about the impacts of salmon farming in Norway being the core center of where salmon farming has happened, and is it's this industry, salmon farming, that's come about in about 45 years, really rapidly. It's hidden from view. It's kept in a system that essentially they treat as an open sewer because they think it's just all disappearing into the sea. But these hidden impacts about where the food comes from, which include not only West African fish, but also Brazilian soy, it is a really fascinating story of, rapid treating of an ecosystem as an exploitable resource for food as a commodity to make profit. And then we speak to Hazel Healy and Brigitte Weir from DSMOG, who've investigated these hidden food supply chains in fish meal and really uncovered some really impactful, damaging data that's required huge amounts of work. And so they talk to us about how hard it is to investigate food supply chains. We talked to Aliou Ba from Greenpeace Africa about the social impacts of overexploitation and fisheries collapse in West Africa, and why these people take this incredibly dangerous journey to try to bring livelihoods and support their families. And I think one of the things that he said really, really stuck with me, you know, that these people, they don't have a life. So getting on a boat that's potentially fatally dangerous to them is not the risk that we would think it is. So seeing, you know, the impacts of our food choices and what's being, you know, provided to us in supermarkets on social systems is super interesting. And then we speak to Maria Alonso Martinez, a researcher who's worked with communities in the greenhouses who are migrants, supporting the ability to have year-round cheap fruit and vegetables is super interesting. And her knowledge on everything from food waste to plastic pollution and all of that is really interesting. And then back to your area, right? Geographically, we speak to Mike Joy and Milena Bojovic about New Zealand dairy and how this rapidly expanding industry that has a huge amount of intensification for the production of milk powder that's exported, you know, it is super interesting, particularly Mike's perspective, having worked for decades on pollution from nitrate and phosphate overuse for the fodder, the grass that these cows are eating. And that ties back into the conversation that we have with Crystal Bennis, who's worked on phosphate extraction from the Bukra mine in occupied Western Sahara that's been occupied by Morocco. So back to West Africa. And that phosphate is extracted sort of illegally under an illegal occupation, taken out of the country with huge environmental and social impacts and exported to New Zealand. So again, it's like focusing on these connections. And also that New Zealand dairy depends on palm kernel to feed the cows that comes from Malaysia and Indonesia. So, you know, these threads are everywhere, these wicked webs. And then finally, we really wanted to try to focus on the positive, right? So we've got an episode with degrowth scholar and activist Anitra Nelson, Amelia Mbile, who is an expert on food sovereignty, particularly how food sovereignty and agroecology translate into Africa. And then diving really deep into a practical example of dealing with a positive solution in a transitional state. We speak to Alison Ali Thomas, who's set up this food waste redistribution hub in my hometown in Shrewsbury. And, you know, what that does working for a charity that redistributes food to the community to bring people together around food. So that's a really lovely, positive conversation. And then finally, Chris Smage, who is a small-scale farmer and a real advocate for like agroecology and small-scale farmers in a decentralized way to support us in times when, you know, we've seen this with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Fertilizer can't get out. That's impacting industrial agriculture across the globe, and small-scale farmers really are the solution there for these shocks and crises that are going to speed up as the climate crisis takes hold and all these other knock-on effects come into play. So a really wide range of different people talking to us about a wide range of different topics, but they're all connected across the world and thematically. And there are some real messages of hope in there as well. So I think it's a really rounded conversation around food. And I think the continued use of food imperialism as a lens to understand how our food system is controlled and how essentially we as consumers are controlled, right? So there's a lot of temptation to believe this lie that, you know, we can change the planet by choosing what we buy, by selecting the right product. And throughout the series, we see that this isn't true, that the choices that we're given are not real choices, that actually you might see 10,000 products on the supermarket shelves and they're owned by 4 different companies. And one of those might be marketed as ecological, but then, you know, it might not be covered in plastic. And so I think it's really rebellious and revolutionary and eye-opening to use this lens. And I think all of our guests speak to that recognition that there is hidden power in the system that is at play that's preventing it from being an equitable and fair system. But there are solutions to that. So yeah, I'm so excited. The more I think about this podcast, the more excited I get.
Well, it's taken us 2 years since we first met. Kind of floated the idea.
It's taken a while.
It has. But do you want to give our listeners a little behind the scenes insight? Because we're now, I mean, let's say it how it is right now, right? This is sometimes how the world of podcasting works, okay? We're in May 2026, right? We first properly spoke about this near the end of 2025. And Neal, you were so ambitious with this project that you honestly thought we would start recording the interviews by the end of 2025, right? Emma and I were like,
Yeah, a little
yeah,
bit
we're not doing
ambitious.
much over the Christmas, New Year, December, January. But
Oh, that's
we
so true.
actually
I'm so sorry.
started the recording in February. We're now here in May, entering June. Do you want to give an insight into the incredible amount of work that has gone into this? And we're going to say it on behalf of Emma and I, 99% of this work has been done by yourself. But it's not just, Emma and I have been doing this our seventh year. We send out some emails, interesting guests. We've read a book or seen an interview. It's like, oh, that could be a good guest. We send an email. Most of the time, people don't respond. We get a lucky response back, or we get a return guest. Hey, do you want to do this? We put some quick talking points together, record. By the next week, the episode's out. This has been very different. Do you want to share a little insight into the incredible amount of work that has gone into this incredible series?
Well, I mean, that's very generous of you, Ben, but I think, firstly, it hasn't felt like work because it's been so much fun. So thank you very much for that. But it is all because too many people said yes. We invited a lot of people thinking like a third of them would say yes, and they pretty much all said yes. And that led us to have more than one, because, I mean, we could have had 18 episodes, separate episodes, but actually the core, really important stuff lent itself from each person's interview so well to be dovetailed that we wanted to make these 6 episodes that combine people to really show the power of connected information. Different perspectives on the same thing really lead to a much more powerful story. So yeah, the way we've done this is we performed like 18, I think, interviews, and then we've gone through and extracted the bits that lend themselves well to be combined with other people. And that's led us to six episodes with between 2 and 4 people in them. And that was quite a lot harder than just having a single episode that you edit down. But what we discovered really was that these interviews, I mean, you were both in almost all of them, right? That they were so interesting. There was just too much to not publish at all. So we've ended up with all of the individual interviews that we're going to be publishing separately as well, because there's other amazing insights on, like things about food waste and conviviality. So there are these concepts that are super interesting, but maybe not the best fit for a summary episode that is absolutely vital to get out there. So we're basically getting, 2 birds with 1 stone, but it's such a huge amount of rich information that, I mean, Kelly is being the one doing the really hard job of editing. And it's like, like 18 hours almost of stuff. It's so rich.
Because Kelly was a late addition to this, right? Because initially, like you say, you didn't expect the response, and we thought
we can do that.
We still thought maybe 6 episodes, but we'll have 1 or 2 guests, and we'll have them both on the show. And then we're like, but how are we going to do that? And so we changed the format. We changed our minds quite a lot of times as well along the journey. And then all of a sudden, I think we initially landed on maybe 15 episodes. And then, actually, we haven't covered this angle. So let's bring someone else in. And then all of a sudden, like you say, that's a lot. So you managed to reach out to your good friend Kelly, who I don't think she realized what she was getting into. But
thank you, Kelly. You're an angel.
Thank you, Kelly.
Oh, thank you, Kelly, because I didn't have to do any editing in this one. But it wasn't just that. I mean, again, insight for our listeners, it's transcripts, and you've gone and looked for all those good points. Because honestly, from my end, it's like, wow, this has really come together so well. But there has been so much. And like you say, so much good content in individual interviews that for us, normally, one of those interviews is a fantastic episode on its own. So yes, we will be, surprise, releasing all those individually later in the year. But yeah, bringing this all together has been a huge amount of work, especially when you got 4 or 5 people on 1 episode. That's a lot of work.
It's a lot. It is. But it was really interesting to be using, I mean, I'm a natural scientist by training, but I've sort of delved into social science for quite some time in my previous academic job. and now sort of call myself a social anthropologist really in the work that I'm doing. And using approaches like thematic analysis to go through transcripts just came as second nature, and it made it quite formulaic. And from a methodological framework, it didn't feel hard at all. So it has just been such a joy. And it's a story. I mean, I think looking at the episodes that we have, those stories just emerged by themselves. And so it didn't take a lot of structuring. It did just emerge. It was really natural because the stories are so important. But I mean, focusing on the story, normally Planet Pulse Pacific has this Australia and New Zealand focus, right? And I mean, you very kindly included me because although I'm a researcher based in the UK, I had been out to Australia and was, looking at, as a photographer, photographing your beautiful nature there and the problems that it's facing. But bringing it back to you both, how does this global story of food imperialism and the case studies that we've heard about, how does that fit into the scope and interests of Planet Pulse Pacific?
Well, I think we've always brought stories about planetary health forward, but the more that we talk to people, the more we kind of realize that you can't separate planetary health from the broader systems that are shaping our world. And, we've talked a lot about environmental systems and economical systems in recent years. But Neal, honestly, once we had you on as a guest, it kind of just all clicked how political food actually is. It's not just about diet and the environment. It's about labor and trade and land and power and culture and all of these things. Who gets to access the resources and who doesn't? So really, this series feels like a natural extension of what Planet Pulse Pacific has always been trying to explore, and that's the interconnectedness of everything. So I'm really excited for our usual listeners to be able to hear this, and hopefully we reach a really broad audience with this because it's applicable to everyone in all corners of the globe.
We've got to remember that our two countries, Australia and New Zealand, we've been colonized by the same entities that colonized other parts of global south, right? So that connection automatically is there, that we're tied to the same system, because why were we colonized? New Zealand started with whaling and timber, and Australia for other resources as well. So, there's that connection. Dr. Mike Joy, who's on one of our episodes, he's been a regular on our episode for the last 7 years. I think he's been on 7 times actually. And we've had other guests as well talk about the degradation of our waterways, talk about the rate of extinction of our freshwater fish and other ecosystems. Salmon, we've spoken about this, the impacts in Tasmania. So we did say this, when we first explored the idea of the series, is I remember saying, if we can find a way to link it back to our part of the world, we're in, because it's what makes us unique. As a podcast is we need to focus on our issues because we are bad ourselves. But it was so easy to link it. I mean, it's sad and horrible to say, but it was very easy to link it. We saw it straight away. It's like, wow, we are so connected, and what each episode linked back to our part of the world. And you've mentioned it, Neal, the palm kernel, the phosphorus, the salmon industry. Like Emma says, it just makes sense. And I think whilst we maybe have isolated our listeners a little bit and said, hey, let's focus on here, this series actually says, let's look broader again, and let's remind ourselves that we're not isolated. And yes, we're 2 islands, one big one small one, but we're still part of the same planet and its challenges. So it made sense. And again, I think we'll just need to give a shout out to Dr. Jen Lavers, a friend of the show, whom we've had on the show, and she's recommended so many phenomenal guests, and obviously the connection with you and all the amazing work over the years that she continues to do on Lord Howe Island and other parts of Australia. I mean, that's how this connection came about. So we're super privileged to have been part of this. Our podcast will never be the same again. I mean, this is, with these episodes. But it's been an absolute privilege for us to host the series and share this not just with our listeners, but new listeners now to the podcast. And we encourage our listeners to look back at the archives. Yes, we're rebranding ourselves temporarily as, but we're still the same. We still have the archive of a lot of other phenomenal guests we've had on the show. So definitely dig deeper if there's particular parts of the series that pique your interest. There's more of it.
I mean, maybe we should explain what to expect from the series, right? We've been dived into it for so long. it's important to signpost what it is. We are starting at the end of June with 6 episodes. We've talked about the guests for those episodes before, but we've got those weekly episodes and then the full interviews coming afterwards. I think planned for 2 a week. So taking a sizable chunk of your time schedule for the podcast. Thank you very much.
We're super happy. Let's work for us. But yeah, every Monday. So every Monday, make sure you subscribe to your podcasting platform, whether it be Spotify, Apple, and of course you're listening to this already, so you know where you're listening. But every Monday we drop a new episode. So it's 6 episodes for the series, excluding this one. This is more the introduction, the prologue, and there will be a wrap-up, a bit more of a reflection episode, I think, at the end of this. And then we will be releasing the individual interviews, which you definitely don't want to miss because it goes way deeper.
And all of the information about the whole series and the wider project is going to be online at thesalmonandthetomato.org/listen. Right. So you
all
can
the show notes.
Yeah. Pictures of all of our guests, which is always nice.
Yes.
And information about the wider project too. So remember to look out for Edible Empire.
And Neal, just not forgetting, you have mentioned, but your exhibitions, because there's a number of them, they're all interlinked with us. So do you want to just share that again with our listeners?
So if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly if you're in Germany, the Convivium Food Systems at the Limit exhibition is taking place at the TUM Museum of Architecture in Munich. It's open now and until the 18th of October, 2026. And you can check out the Salmon and the Tomato group piece, which is a very immersive, life-sized recreation of a greenhouse, a documentary film, books and photographs and sculptures. At the same time, in July, photographs from the Salmon and Tomato are going to be at the Royal Geographical Society in London as part of Earth Photo 2026. So quite a few things going on, but check out the website to find out more.
And lastly, for all our listeners, do you want to tell us a little bit about the children's book that people can buy off the website as well?
So the Salmon and Tomato children's book is a story about where our food comes from, about other cultures, and it is aimed at children between 7 and 11. A beautiful story that's been produced in collaboration with children's book author Juliette Nolan and investigative journalist from the Gambia, Mustafa Mana, and illustrated by Marilia Aruda. It has activities in the background to learn a bit more about where our food comes from. And it's available in the UK to order. We're trying to get it in other countries, but Brexit and postage are proving a bit of a problem. But you can find that in the museum in Munich as well, and on sale at physical locations in the future, I hope.
Exciting. Well, that brings us to the end of this prologue teaser episode. Thank you for listening. We hope you're now frantically hungry for the series. Join us on our first episode where we'll be talking to Professors Harriet Friedman and Raj Patel about the history of our food systems, whether they're really broken, and what the impacts of food imperialism are on a global scale.
So check out the website for the show notes and for more information about the podcast series and the wider project called The Salmon and the Tomato at www.thesalmonandthetomato.org. From Planet Pulse Pacific, from Neal, Ben, Emma, and Kelly, see you next time.